Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Future of End User Computing, a conversation with Shawn Bass and Dane Young, hosted by Sonnet IO. And now I'd like to hand it over to Dharmendra Mohan, CEO of Sonnet IO.
Yeah, thank you, Trish, and thanks everyone for attending the webinar. My name is Dharmendra Mohan, co-founder and CEO of Sonnet.io. Shawn.io is a cloud-native VDI solution that provides secure access to SaaS applications, private web apps, desktop applications, and virtual desktops. No need to deploy anything in end-user devices. Users access all their tools through the browser. Our goal is to make it easy for IT to manage remote access. IT can do the setup within an hour, scale elastically, and onboard users in seconds. Zero trust security and visibility is built into the platform without requiring any additional point solutions. You can visit Shawn.io for details. I'm excited to have the opportunity to host Shawn Bass and Dane Young, veterans of end-user computing. I'm looking forward to listening to their views on the future of end-user computing, given the technical advancements in cloud computing and the emerging trends affecting EUC and the VDI. Thank you.
Thanks, DM. I appreciate the kickoff, and thank you everyone for joining. It's wonderful having you all here today. I have the great pleasure of welcoming a good friend of mine, someone I've known for at least 15 years, I suppose, maybe a little bit longer, Dane Young. Dane, say hello to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. Glad to have you.
So I thought we would kick off this webinar with a very brief intro of each of us, just for those that are joining that may not be familiar with either myself or Dane. So really quick backgrounder on myself. I've been in the EUC space for about 30 years. I got started on the very, very early days of Citrix technology with WinView, and then the first release of WinFrame 1.5. And I've been in the EUC space the last 30 years. Most recently, I was the Chief Technology Officer of the End User Computing Business Unit at VMware. I'm currently advising a number of startups, including Sonnet.io, and they are obviously sponsoring this webinar. So thank you to Sonnet for bringing all these folks together on these webinar series. And I'd like to turn it over to Dane, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. Greatly appreciated. So I got started in my IT career in 2002, not quite as long as some of the other IT and EUC veterans in the space. But at that time, Windows Server 2000 with the early releases of terminal services was really the thing. And so this was pre-remote desktop services, pre-RDSH, all before that. So that was my first exposure working in IT and doing systems administration work. And then over the years, it kind of evolved and I got more exposure to Presentation Server 4.0, which was on Windows Server 2003 at the time. Started doing my first virtual desktop infrastructure deployments, which were on vSphere 3 and 4 with early VDM releases in the 4.x days. That was particularly for
That was a painful time.
Those were very painful times. Yeah, the biggest challenges that we ran into were all the peripherals and trying to get USB pass-through and all of these devices in a banking industry to function as expected. So financial services has always been key to success in a VDI and end-user computing landscape. That's where a lot of my historical professional background comes. But I think my first exposure to vSphere was 2.x days when it was ESX, even before ESXi. And just kind of have loved all of the technologies around this virtualization cloud space and have evolved in consulting and working with different clients in these technologies to now everything is hybrid multi-cloud is the big buzzword, which we'll get into more as we're diving into this. So very excited to be here and more excited than ever to be in this space of end user computing and IT consulting.
Awesome. Thanks, Dane. Appreciate it. So for those that signed up for the webinar, we included a list of topics that we're going to be going through in this webinar that I think are very topical and relevant for today's challenges in end user computing. So what I'd like to do is just dive into the first topic that we included there, which is, what are the critical components for end user computing solutions at every scale, whether you're a small business or whether you're a large global enterprise. What are the critical components? And obviously, many people think of critical components as like, the infrastructure and then your VDI software stack and some of those kind of things. But I'd like to turn this over to Dane to kind of give me your take on what the critical aspects of end user computing are. Obviously, you spent a long time in consulting, as I did in the past as well. So what is your take on the critical components of end user computing?
Yeah, it's a good topic that is kind of timeless in my perspective. I remember going back 15 plus years ago, working at a reseller and systems integrator in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as you would expect, we had a lot of people that were familiar with selling hardware, and they knew all the speeds and feeds of switches and routers and how to position and sell those to customers. But this whole notion of end user computing for most sellers is a foreign concept. And so even back then, 10, 15 years ago, I would create PowerPoints and educate our sellers on here's the basics of end user computing. Here's what it means when we say application virtualization. Here's what it means when we say desktop virtualization and containerizing the desktop in a hosted environment. And what I created at that time was a very rudimentary PowerPoint that went through all of our vendors that we had in our line card. That's a generic term for the approach that we use in the space. But it's basically like, here's all the authorized software and hardware companies that we can sell and position to our customers. And then I mapped them to a hierarchy of needs where the customers may say, oh, well, I have these operating system management needs. What kinds of technologies would fit in there? I have these security needs. What kinds of technologies would fit in there? And it was a very easy way to kind of give the picture visually of like, hey, here's all these logos that you would go to a trade show and you walk around the floors and you'd see all these different vendors, but like, where do they fit in the overall landscape of the enterprise IT infrastructure? And so that is something that I did early on. I have to give a lot of applause to our good friend and colleague in the industry, Ruben Sprout, who, for those that haven't already gone to Vision and downloaded the white paper, there's a very good, it's called the EUC Hexagrid. So if you do a search for that, Hexagrid is spelled Hexagrid. If you do a search for that and you find EUC Hexagrid, what it does is it visualizes just what I'm talking about with some of that enterprise IT landscape as it revolves around end user computing, and it visualizes.
Hey, let me actually share that I've got Ruben's tweet up here.
Oh,
folks
look at
can
that.
see that.
He's
so there is the
sharing content on a webinar. There's a novel concept.
So we'll just leave this up for a couple of moments, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit and kind of how it's shaped the way you've looked at things.
Yeah, no, I think it's perfect because like when you're zoomed out on it, which we are, we're very challenged to actually see the details inside of the hexagrid. And the point is, there's a lot of stuff going on. And the message that I would have for IT practitioners and people that are proficient in end user computing is that in any given enterprise, any given mid-market or large enterprise IT organization, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of vendors at play. There's a lot of technologies, some of which complement each other, some of which stack on top of each other and stomp on each other and create conflicts. So just understanding that very rarely are you going to see a single sole provider environment unless it's Joe's Muffler Shop and they've got a basic, Windows small business server with some clients attached to it. But the larger the organization, the more complexity, the more silos, the more departments, you're going to have all these vendors and technology in there. So what Ruben has done, and again, props to Ruben, this was a great brainchild that he and colleagues have put together. He's talked about the focus areas that go around the outside of this hexagrid, which focus on mobility, collaboration, security, sustainability, flexibility, and user experience. And those are all the areas that we focus on around the hexagrid. And then within the hexagrid, there's 6 key areas, hence the term hex. And those 6 key technology areas are broken up into virtual desktops and apps, collaboration, app management, access, device and OS management, and security. And so if we took any one of those particular areas, we could have an hour webinar on each individual topic and say, here's all of the vendors that tend to play in this space. Here's the overview of how these 6 areas kind of collaborate and work together. Here's where they overlap. but the general notion for this webinar is we're talking about the future of end user computing. So, you know, anytime you go on Google Maps and you say, I want to go to that place, you have to start here, and we have to know where we are today in order to envision the future. So when I think of like, where are things going, I often look at where are things today, where have they come from in the last 3 years, and where are we headed as far as those mega trends are concerned. And I think the hexagrid does a really good job of kind of putting that into a picture, a concept that's otherwise difficult to understand.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this hexagrid approach, and I agree with you, props to Ruben for putting this together. It's a great visualization to kind of sum up the multifaceted aspects of what end user compute has become. I mean, when I got started in end user compute, and likewise for you, you've been in it for a while now, you know, we thought of EUC as being, you know, relatively simple in terms of the moving parts and technologies. Like there was your presentation layer, whether that was a Citrix or a VMware or a Microsoft stack, and it was like you had VDI or you had server-based computing. It was kind of, you know, one of two choices, and they each had their pros and cons. And of course, over time, we started to recognize that you needed to also become a bit of an expert in infrastructure because of, you know, the time when I got involved in this, and likewise for you, you know, it was a time when there was rapid growth of VDI and server-based computing. And it was a period of time where, you know, people didn't really have infrastructure scaling where it needed to be. So we spent all of our days worrying about things like IOPS and read-write IO patterns and all these kinds of things because we were trying to deliver a good experience for the user that would rival their laptop or whatever endpoint device they were using before. And if you didn't scale the infrastructure appropriately, you could actually deliver a subpar user experience. Right. But what's interesting is, you know, there's been so many things that have come into end user computing that probably have always been part of it, but maybe just we weren't thinking about it at that point in time. But you know, people moving into things like cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, using desktops in the cloud, desktop as a service, that's become a huge thing the last couple of years. People have started focusing more on end user experience analytics, the whole DEX market, you know, trying to compute a score, if you will, to articulate whether or not somebody is having a good user experience, whether it is in a VDI or server-based computing environment, or whether it's just a physical endpoint that they're using, a desktop or laptop, and leveraging analytics and user experience metrics to try to articulate if that experience is right-sized or not. And it's amazing because, you know, we used to always think about right-sized when we think about VDI or server-based computing, but in a lot of ways, like, you've got to make sure you're right sizing even physical devices you give to your users. You know, not every user needs a 16-core machine, but not every user can get by with a single core or dual core, whatever the case may be. So it's important to be considering all aspects of that. And what I think is really interesting about the EUC market today is that it's really branched out into so many different areas. You know, years ago, end user computing people weren't concerned with how people were accessing web applications and dealing with things like secure web gateways and CASB and SASE and all these different areas. Now it's become an area of focus that a lot of companies are saying, hey, even if I'm delivering some of my users on VDI or SBC, some of them on physical endpoints, I need to make sure I'm giving users a great experience for all types of applications, web apps, SaaS apps, mobile apps, native Windows apps, whatever the case may be. And it's starting to get people to think more about, how do I measure end user experience for every type of application, not just my Windows apps that people are using, but how do I articulate and measure user experience for their web and SaaS apps? So that's an interesting area that things have pivoted to. And then there's a whole adjacent area around data security and data protection. And I think maybe that's a good lead-in or kickoff for us to talk about the next topic, which is how applications and data are really reshaping the EUC landscape. I do want to make one other quick point on Hexagrid before I forget, is to say that even though Ruben put this diagram out there with all these different areas and all these subcategories, it doesn't necessarily mean that every organization is going to need every one of these aspects for every single user and every single use case. There may be some subset of your users where a well-managed endpoint is going to be a great solution for them. There's going to be some users that VDI or SBC or DAS is going to be the right solution for them. There may be cases where SASE or CASB is a key criteria of your end user compute environment. There's other cases where it's just not necessary for the use cases that your users are doing. So the Hexagrid is a great kind of overview of the whole EUC landscape, but organizations need to be thinking about the use cases that their end users are using in order to figure out what the right mix of these technologies are for each user in each use case. And in some cases, you may find yourself using a multitude of these different technology solutions for different use cases that have different needs. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think just to kind of piggyback on that, I think the need for EUC departments, divisions, however you want to phrase it, digital workspace, platform, computing, whatever that team may be that has the charter for understanding these technologies and then fitting them within their organization. The teams that I've seen the most effective in that, to not just shape the environment that they've been handed, like through attrition or through like, oh, well, this person left, so now you're left with the bag holding this technology that you didn't implement. The ones that are forward thinking, that look towards the future, which is all what we're talking about right here, are the organizations that internally take on a lot of those obligations and responsibilities that historically they would outsource to like a services provider or systems integrator or value-added reseller. Those organizations that actually take on the ownership of that, they often are put in a position to go do technology evaluations and see what the landscape has as far as these technologies are concerned, and then understand the business problems that they're trying to address and how they're going to fit technologies in that. So I hope that with Hexagrid and other things, that people are really getting the message that this isn't just a really slick way to tell the reseller ecosystem and to tell the vendors, like, here's the up and coming players in the space so you can go educate your customers. That is a very applicable approach for sure, but service provider mindsets within organizations are largely shaping EUC for the future. And the more that I see this in successful organizations where they have directors, they have VPs that actually believe this vision, that their goal is to service their customers being their end users. Their end users need to service their customers, which is ultimately the organization's customers. That mindset of service-oriented architecture, for lack of a better term, is the mindset that moves the ball forward, so that organizations aren't just saying, well, here's the technology stack that we're stuck with because somebody else purchased it, we got handed it from previous leadership, but here's the landscape of technologies that are out there, and here are some technologies that we can use to solve these really critical challenges that we have within our organization. So my hope, as I go and talk to organizations about Hexagrid or other emerging trends to like identify where these vendors fit in the market, is don't just take it from me. Do your own research and understanding these vendors and how they fit, so that when you get those users or the business leaders coming to you and say, hey, we have a problem with externalizing our IP and getting that to our business partners that need to access and interface with our data models, how can we address this? What kinds of technologies are on the market to help us address these needs? Those are the things that I'm seeing as a trend that is ultimately the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. The light and the optimism that I have is that organizations are increasingly getting this, that they need to become service provider oriented as they relate to their business units and their customers.
You know what, Dane, something that just crossed my mind that kind of ties directly into your point. The organizations I've seen most successful with end user computing are those that have moved away from a silo-based approach of a VDI team or an SBC team and an endpoint management team and a network security team and all those kind of things, and started saying, like, what is our end user compute facing technologies, and merging those groups together in a way that, you know, puts the user as the center of the universe, and all of the technologies that service that end user having one core team that represents that to the employees, in my experience, seem to be the most successful at delivering a great service level. So excellent point that you made. And I think that organizational transformation that mimics that is what's seeing great success.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
let's shift over to the changing landscape of applications and how people are using data and how that is changing the, what we consider the EUC landscape. So give me your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I just kind of dipped my toe in the water on that one as a preview, but you would have thought 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when companies like ShareFile or GoSendIt or whatever these email-based cloud application data transfer solutions were, when those came to the market, it kind of solved this problem of externalizing IP. But increasingly, what we're seeing is that organizations have either line of business or critical applications that largely run on Windows that they need access, whether it's internal employees or contractors, or in some cases, business partners that need to come in and work with them on these data models or data sets, or whatever you may classify the data as. The important thing is the data is what is important. The application is just a means to get to the data. And then the presentation layers, things like application virtualization or RDP, VDI, those types of things. That's just the presentation layer. But ultimately, the data is the part that most organizations are really focusing in on right now. As far as how do we transform EUC, they're focusing on the data. And where do they want that data to be accessed from? Where do they want to permit that data to be downloaded to? Where do they not want to permit that data to be downloaded to? And this gets into all kinds of regulatory compliance related areas, and the European Union and some of the things that go along with where data can be stored. Those are all very important factors that I think are shaping how we're delivering end user computing, because ultimately the data is, in a lot of organizations, the crown jewels. It's what differentiates them from their competitors. It's what gives them advantage and go to market faster or better or more efficiently than other organizations that are trying to do that. And so if that data ends up in the wrong hands, well, there's hell to pay. And so protecting the data is ultimately what I think all of these EUC technologies kind of focus around, is the security aspect of the data. Now, all of that being the case, we're seeing a massive adoption of cloud apps and web SaaS apps, which is making the protection of the data potentially more challenging, right? Because you're externalizing or you're outsourcing the protection of your data to a lot of these cloud and SaaS application providers. But almost every single application, or at least those that I have had direct interface with that are web or SaaS or that leverage these types of concepts, they have an import-export capability where data still can find its way into or out of that tenant, that environment. And so the organizations aren't as concerned of, will this app install on a Windows device? They're more concerned about what kinds of devices are we permitting to access this application that is hosted in a SaaS provider's environment? And then what mechanisms do we have to control the data exfiltration, which is natural when they need to dump things to Excel, or they need to churn into a different report system. They need to move it over to this other environment and do some report viewer type of capabilities on it. So those aspects of SaaS and web applications are just as important as the age-old question, will it install in a multi-user Windows environment? And the answer is generally yes, but you might have to massage it just a little bit. But where is that data getting stored, placed temporarily or permanently? And then how much control do you have over that data when it comes out of that application?
So you've touched on a number of different things that I want to kind of recap and then break down, and we'll have a quick conversation about. So number one, significant increase in the number of web and SaaS applications adopted by organizations. Obviously, in the early days of EUC, a lot of web and SaaS applications we would serve up as a hosted browser inside of the VDI environment or inside of the SBC environment. You have to kind of ask yourself, though, is that always the right place for those things to be? Is it the right fit to run a hosted browser on VDI or SBC? Right. Because it does require a lot of resources, and it's expensive technology to run the equivalent of a web or SaaS-based application. But you touched on another aspect that I think is really important that we talk about, is the mobility of the data the needs of the users to be able to export data out of a web or SaaS application, maybe massage it with a third-party application, something, let's say Excel, very common one, and then re-upload that data to some other web or SaaS application or back into the original parent web or SaaS application. That brings up a lot of challenges and security concerns, as you talked about. Theft of IP, loss of IP, somebody encrypting data, ransomware type stuff. There's a ton of different aspects of that data protection and data security that, to go back to that hexagrid comment from the previous topic, do I need to think about augmenting a VDI or SBC-based approach with something like a Cloud Web Security Gateway, a SASE, CASB type approach, to be able to try to find some way to protect the transport of that data, to ensure that it's not uploaded to somebody's personal email or uploaded to their Dropbox or sent to the wrong unintended recipient. Like, there's a whole host of security challenges that go along with that. So excellent point on the transformation of the application landscape. Obviously, it's still going to be, and I've said this for a long time, that there's a long tail of Windows apps that are going to be in the market. There's somewhere north of 30 million unique Windows applications that are used by businesses today. Those are going to take a very long time to go away. So even though there is this huge growth of web and SaaS applications, we're going to be living with this mixture or hybrid classic, fat client applications or thick client applications, as well as web and SaaS applications for some time in the future.
Yeah, to quote a very smart fellow who used to give presentations at this conference called Bri Forum, in the age of the post-apocalyptic nuclear meltdown, there will be cockroaches and Windows applications remaining.
I did have Twinkies in there at one point in time, but then it looked like they were going away, so I removed Twinkies from that quote. But yes, thank you, Dane.
So I think that's really the core of what we're talking about, is that the evolution of the applications is largely moving off of Windows. In my early days of my career, 20-something years ago, people used to ask me constantly, why aren't you a Mac fanboy? You're into technology. You should be all about Mac. And at the time, because I was still early in my career, I was like, I need to get into the weeds on every particular aspect of this operating system and the applications and how everything functions. And the way that I do that is by running on it permanently. And they said, well, why is that? And I said, well, Macs are great toys for personal use, but they're not largely seen in the enterprise space. How that has changed in the last 20-something years, right? Now we're seeing a massive proliferation of Mac devices in the enterprise with management capabilities, with the ability to bring that identity provider into that environment, with the ability to manage the applications and the data and the encryption and everything else. So like the form factor, the platform, the operating system changes, but the approaches of how we're managing end user computing does not change. And that's something that we're seeing continuing to transform. I would say largely, as it relates to this whole application migration piece, the move to web and SaaS applications is actually quite simple as it relates to EUC and how you adopt and transform that, with one caveat. As long as you don't concern yourself with security, you can do whatever the Wild West has in store for getting that user connected to that application, whether it's hosted in another provider or otherwise. But the second that the EUC team concerns themselves with what the security team concerns themselves with, which they should, by the way, they should be considering the other needs of the other team that they're closely tied to, which is security. As soon as they do that, the EUC technologies that are implemented and supported and adopted, those have to be security-minded technologies. They cannot just be Wild West, oh, just deploy this and then run it wherever. And if you do that, I mean, the nature is your IP and the stuff that you care about as your crown jewels will eventually get out on the dark web, and then your company is exploited and vulnerable for, in some cases, a long period of time. Because once passwords and URLs and all this kinds of stuff gets exploited out there, it's hard to close all of those security holes and get everything back.
I'm gonna put a pin in the security topic for a moment, because we are going to talk about zero trust. I want to pivot really quickly and talk about the investment trends that are shaping the EUC industry. There's been a lot of turmoil that's happened in end user compute in the last couple of years. So just let me get your take on what's been happening there.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong, everybody loves the buying trends of X company gobbling up 6, 10, 20 companies in the span of a 5-year period. It makes all kinds of things fun, most especially integration and making all these products work across all these different silos that might have different application development languages, different APIs that they're integrating. But I've seen that trend has died down largely, and the purchases that are being made and being aggregated and brought into an umbrella company, they seem to be smaller, more bite-sized, more manageable pieces instead of these large hundreds of millions of dollar products. And obviously there's exceptions, Splunk and Juniper. Those types of exceptions are standalone companies that can continue to function and operate as standalones that don't require a large amount of integration. But it wasn't just, even 10 years ago, we were seeing large companies. And when I say large, I mean like tier ones, Citrix, Microsoft, VMware type companies that were gobbling up, in some cases, 5 to 10 independent companies in a 3 to 5 year period. And then all of the app teams had all the nightmare of trying to manage all of that. And so what I've observed is that the shift, as organizations are trying to streamline and optimize their sales process, as they're trying to streamline and optimize their pricing and packaging and how they put their products into market, they have slowed down with this buying frenzy, if you will, of gobbling together all these different technologies. And instead, what's really positive is I've actually seen another trend, which is, hey, we need to partner better with the other end user computing industry technologies that are out there, where we don't need to buy them, but maybe we can increase our collaboration so there's tighter integration with these companies that aren't under our umbrella. And so I think that requires a bit of a shift. Obviously, private equity has its own fair share of challenges that needs to be addressed. I've observed, this is just my observation, that there seems to be an increasing investment in application developers and the engineering side of the house, and a decrease in investment in sales and marketing. That's what I've observed. And that's something that we've seen in LinkedIn and in the market, is you see, there's layoffs, but there's also all these open recs. So maybe your thoughts on that in your experience with PE as well.
Yeah, I think private equity, obviously private equity firms vary greatly in terms of how they operate, but most private equity firms are typically trying to get a relatively quick return on investment. I say relatively quick in the 3 or 4 year time frame, although a lot of PE firms really, in practicality, have been closer to a 4 to 7 year time horizon on getting an ROI on their investment. But I agree with you. I've seen the last couple of years that a lot of the private equity acquisitions that have happened have really turned into heavier, more focused investments in R&D at the unfortunate expense of sales and marketing and G&A overhead type roles. Certainly, there have been a lot of layoffs. I would say there's been layoffs in tech in general. It's not specific to private equity. Tech has been hit pretty hard the last few years. But I definitely have noticed some change with private equity in the last couple of years in terms of a deeper focus on investment in R&D. But keep in mind, too, there's also been a lot of venture capital that's been invested the last couple of years in EUC space. So ControlUp did a $100 million venture capital raise. Trying to remember, that was probably like 3 years ago at this point in time, 2021. Enterprise browser space has been extremely hot for venture capital. Island's raised $100 million at a $1.5 billion valuation. Talon got acquired by Palo Alto in December 2023. So there seems that there's, in addition to the private equity acquisition, that there's been sort of a revival of venture capital money infusing into the EUC space. And that's actually exciting, I think, for everyone that operates in EUC.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a couple years ago in the Silicon Valley, there was a running joke. All you needed to do was get VC funding, is have something related to storage and IOPS in your name, and all of a sudden, millions would flow through the door. And certainly we're seeing that trend as well, but in another technology area, which I know we're going to dive into as part of this webinar, and that's artificial intelligence. So from my standpoint, I always look at, what are the products that are on the truck today? What products can we make use of and utilize in deployments or customer environments today? And then what are the trends as far as things that we're seeing, where things are going in the future? And so as far as the mainstream tier one vendors and the investments that are happening today, I think that the future is untold yet. The future is unwritten yet as it relates to the private equity return on investment. But I do see, and I hope to see the effects of the investment moving things into the engineering and R&D focus, because for a large part of the market, there has been stagnation, particularly in the last 4 years since COVID started, where they've kind of been sitting on their laurels of like, well, we don't really need to innovate at the same pace that we did 10 years ago or 15 years ago to get this massive market adoption. What I am hoping is that all of these PE investments are going to get the engineering and R&D team refocused on their number one competitors in the space. And by that, I mean the 800-pound gorilla in the room that is Microsoft, who we all know and love. And I have great affection for Microsoft as a company. I've never worked for them, but I've built my IT career on Microsoft technologies. And the more capabilities that Microsoft is R&D and investing internally within their core product sets, the more that any company that doesn't have an @Microsoft.com email address is going to have to double down and invest heavier to keep on pace or ahead of where the market is moving Microsoft as far as their investment dollars. So I'm hoping that that actually translates into good value for customers, with PE doubling down on R&D and app dev teams really getting the focus of the investment share.
All right, Dane, I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, so we're going to have to go a little bit quicker in these next few topics. But speaking of accelerated pace of innovation, let's turn our topic to cloud adoption and get your quick thoughts there.
So I think we kind of discussed that we would piggyback in DaaS and cloud adoption in this segment. And so I'll kind of talk to both as a whole. Where people often think of either a managed cloud workspace or a desktop as a service offering, they typically think of this concept of managed service that goes along with the thing. And what I've seen is that there's a shift away from seeing DaaS as strictly a managed service type of capability and more as a platform capability that has the enterprise or the IT organizations in control of the delivery of the desktops and applications, but they're leveraging a lot of simplicity from an architectural standpoint. So that's how I would largely characterize the whole cloud adoption DaaS versus the managed services approach, is that a lot of organizations that I'm working with in particular, they want to leverage DaaS, but they don't want the attachment of managed services being associated with that. They want to maintain the control and the capabilities in-house, but DaaS gives them a lot of flexibility to move faster, where they don't have to stand up all of the underlying infrastructure components just to get a desktop out the door. So that's kind of what I've seen.
So they're treating it a bit more as a elastic infrastructure, but not necessarily changing the modality of how they manage the desktops themselves. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then, when I think of DaaS, I think of a lot of the automation capabilities that go into making the platform more robust and capable than if you had to manually configure all of these products by hand, right? And I think that's what a lot of IT organizations are wanting to get away from, is the manual standing up of a Windows server to deploy a thing, to configure a thing that talks to this other thing that has a load balancer thing. All of those things are things that require management, patience to patch and maintain and support. And then when, as we've seen in the industry, all of these CVEs, these critical vulnerabilities come out and they have to get updated across all of these core components, it's a lot more for customers to manage the patch cycles on individually installed software components versus a DaaS platform that has that one-click notion, or that notion of patch the infrastructure and then it does all the underlying components. So that's what I'm hopeful in seeing as a large adoption. Wherever the customer ends up putting their workload, I mean, there's a lot of flexibility and choice there, whether it's on-prem or public cloud hosted, or hypervisor managed in another public cloud option, which we have seen a big trend of that as well. So those are some of my thoughts as far as cloud adoption. But I think, this notion of everything is on-prem or everything is cloud, that's largely gone. We aren't really seeing a lot of conversations around, well, we have to be one or the other. Most organizations are acknowledging they're doing both. And it's a matter of optimizing the workload for the placement, where it's going, and how
Hey,
it's going
Dane,
to be supported.
quick follow-up question on DAS for you. Are you seeing customers take a use case driven approach for desktop as a service, that these certain personas, these certain work functions go to DAS, or are they just carte blanche saying every one of our use cases is a DAS candidate and just moving groups of users? What's been your experience?
There's a combination of both, and it largely depends on how sensitive the organization is to their pocketbook. And the organizations that just say, hey, we know we're going to spend more if we do a one size fits all approach for every use case across the board. But for us, we see it's worth it because we want that standardization of having everything fit into that one model. That's one approach. And I'm not saying there's anything stupid or wrong about that approach. It is a approach that has to be intentional. Otherwise, the CFO is going to be breathing down your neck every 5 minutes and saying, why are these workloads not optimized for this platform? Right. So if that's the approach, if that's
I think that's a really great point that you're raising. I just want to interject really quickly. People that think you can take the mess that you might have created in your on-prem VDI environment and put it up into desktop as a service without rethinking how you do provisioning and update and power management are going to be getting a rude awakening when they look at the bill for their desktop as a service solution. So yes, you need to think a different approach about how you right size virtual machines, how you power manage them. And a lot of the platform tools do give you options to manage those things. It's just not every company thinks to plan that as part of their implementation.
Yep, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we battle against is how simple it is to get started. And so when it's simple to get started, it's simple to create a hot mess. And then you have to clean up that hot mess later. So always start with the end in mind and design the solution with the end in mind. And that way, when you're getting into the clicking and the doing, you actually know the vision of where you're going instead of just turning knobs and clicking buttons.
All right, 2 more topics we're going to try to get through in the next 8 minutes, and we'll leave 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So quick one on Zero Trust. Obviously, this is probably one of the most overloaded technology terms in the last probably 10, 15, 20 years. But I do want to get your take on how organizations think about Zero Trust principles and applying it to their end user compute solution stack. So give me your quick thoughts on that.
Well, here's how Zero Trust should not work. Hey, I've hired you as a consultant to come in here and help us design and build all this stuff. So I'm not going to give you any permission. Sorry, go away, right? That's how Zero Trust should not work. If you're going to hire somebody to do a job, at least make sure that they have the basic necessities to do the job. And the same applies to the images and the applications and the delivery of the virtual desktops. If you take a sledgehammer approach and you say, well, we're implementing Zero Trust, so nobody has any of the permissions or the capabilities to do their job, sorry, no productivity is going to happen. And then it's going to ultimately fail. And then you're going to have to revert back to the old way of doing things. And so it requires a lot more planning and consideration for the future of what are those things that we're going to need to consider and open up to ensure that our users are productive and can get their job done. And that's what I think of when I think of Zero Trust, is all of the planning that's required that goes into implementing a Zero Trust architecture requires a lot more foresight into what are the things that we're going to have to plan for ahead of time, and not just assume that we can just take a whack-a-mole approach when they come up. Because the whack-a-mole approach, especially as it relates to pinholes and firewalls and security protocols, it works, but it's incredibly painful. It's incredibly time-consuming. And teams ultimately can delay projects by months by taking this approach of, okay, well, we open that hole, we open that hole, we open that hole, instead of looking at solutions that help them map all of that on the front end and give them a better visibility, better vision for what that Zero Trust is going to look like once implemented.
And I think in a lot of ways, what you're talking about here, Dane, is mistakes you've made in the past can cause you a great deal of difficulty as you try to re-engineer for appropriate Zero Trust design principles. I was just talking to an organization unrelated to Zero Trust, but they were battling with how many unique applications that had vulnerabilities that were in their environment. And they were talking with me about, like, how do we fix this? And I was like, well, how many of your end users have admin level privileges on their device and are able to install whatever software they want? And they're like, oh, a good chunk of them. I was like, okay, that's where you start. You start clawing back the admin privileges only to those people that need it, because if you let people install whatever they want, you're never going to wrangle control of your software vulnerabilities because you're not well managing your application estate. And if you're not doing that, you're never going to be in a place where you can manage your vulnerabilities appropriately.
Yeah, and that goes into zero trust, and it goes into a lot of these other like future looking principles that we have. You've used the term a couple times now of well managed, and that's the key in anything that we're talking about with end user computing, is to think about the end state being well managed. We have to think with the end in mind, which is a well managed environment, not simply, well, just give everybody local admin rights, give everybody OEM shipped laptops that have no corporate image, that have no like enterprise software on it, and then give them VPN to everything. Yeah, you can get away with that in a small business that has no concern about security, but you're going to have a hard time adopting some of these technologies like zero trust or single image management or managed endpoints if you take that approach of the sledgehammer of just giving everybody everything from the get-go. Years back, and this is my last little tidbit on the zero trust piece, but years back, I was working with an organization. They said, we're implementing zero trust in a production environment without doing a rebuild side by side. We have to do it in the production environment that is already there. Tell us where we would get started. And I kid you not, where they were at that particular point was a network with a /21 where everything shared the same subnet, and all of their servers and all of their desktops and all of their management VMs for their virtual infrastructure were all on a very flat network with no ability to do, north-south routing of the traffic to actually put in place any of these principles. And so that type of approach is something that I've taken back, from years ago, to say, if you envision that your organization's security department's eventually going to lean towards zero trust as an EUC team, start thinking ahead. Start planning ahead. Don't just drop every desktop and every management server and every component that sits in Active Directory on the same zone that has no firewall rules or no restrictions between them. Even if you have those wide open to start, if you have them on different network segments, that's the first premise of zero trust, is network segmentation, which, NSX and other technologies really got the boom for micro segmentation, which is an evolution of that. So, I mean, just starting with that concept of breaking things up into bite-sized use cases or deployment footprints based on their security nature, the posture that needs to be applied to those, that goes a long way. Even before zero trust, even before any of these other principles that are more extreme come into play, if you have a finance application that only 12 people in your organization should access that finance application, start there. Put that into a dedicated segment. You have to come through this segment to get access to this database that has that finance app. Like, those are the basics of zero trust that then go a long ways to transferring into a longer term strategy.
I think the important point that you're bringing up there is, if someone has a mess with their network architecture, they don't need to blow it all up and start over and re-envision the entire desktop solution from the ground up and spend 24, 48 months getting there. They can take a stepwise approach and do a pool by pool kind of redesign based on use case, apply the appropriate segmentation, swing users over, repurpose infrastructure. It can be an evolving model that happens over time. It doesn't have to be a stop everything and start over approach.
Yeah, and often when it is a stop everything and start over approach, the fallout is pretty significant, and you have to look at the impact to user productivity, their user experience. If they can't perform their job for 2 days while you're fixing all of the defects in the system that you gave them, that's not a viable rollout strategy. So taking a stepwise approach and doing it iteratively over time often ends up being a better, more effective application for the user's benefit, because they're not dead in the water while you're rolling out this new system.
All right, one last topic. I want to do this one kind of quick, even though it's a topic that probably deserves an entire hour-long session. We can't have a webinar in 2024 without talking about AI in some capacity. Now, I know from LinkedIn and Twitter that you were just out at GTC attending that conference, and just I want to get your quick thoughts on what's new and exciting in the space of AI that you heard at GTC, or what impacts to EUC that are recent announcements.
Well, the new generation of GPUs has a product name called Blackwell. And aside from the product name being cool, it was named a last name of the gentleman it was named after. The capabilities in terms of AI inference and how they measure things in T-flops is like a 30+x improvement from previous generations. So when we are looking at the types of innovation that are happening that affect AI, the single most impactful unit of measure is the GPU itself. All the rest of the data center, all the power cooling and everything else that goes into that kind of builds a framework around the GPU, but that is by far the most important thing. So we're seeing a tremendous shift in the industry as it relates to AI. I keep my pulse on this market mainly because it is near and dear to technology that I love, which is GPUs. And I got early start with GPUs, first with gaming and then with CAD CAM and architecture engineering applications like AutoCAD and Adobe Suite and so on. But the GPU landscape is largely evolving, and organizations are making use of these GPUs both for AI as well as application delivery and graphics visualization. So I'm always going to keep my heartbeat on that market. And what we're watching is how is AI going to transform end user computing, and what are the things that we need to be watching for as it relates to the products and the capabilities that we're able to bring to the market for our end user computing users, that segment of the market. And that's the space that I'm particularly interested in.
Excellent. It's fascinating because when I saw NVIDIA put out the Hopper series GPUs and all the adoption of AI that drove, everyone kept thinking like, oh, NVIDIA is going to get dethroned. There's going to be somebody else that's going to catch up. And yet you keep seeing with every new iteration they come out with. I mean, Blackwell is just ridiculous at the inference performance and that kind of stuff. It doesn't seem like NVIDIA is going to give up their crown anytime soon based on the advancements they keep making. So it's fascinating to see. Hey, tell you what, I want to go over to a couple of questions that were submitted. I'm going to kind of combine two of them into one because they both talk to the same aspect. They're referring to the hexagrid, and both of these comments sort of articulated that hexagrid is sort of an evidence of complexity in the end user computing landscape, and or that it seems like it's right for simplicity in deployment, use experience. Would you agree with that? And then what impact do you think that generative AI may have on the future of how EUC, both for admins and end users? So what are your thoughts on that topic? Is it indicative of complexity?
Hexagrid and AI, Gen AI.
Well, they were kind of related questions, but they were both talking about the complexity of end user compute, this whole landscape of technology solutions, and is AI going to simplify that?
I don't think AI is going to simplify that aspect of it, at least not initially, because the complexity is largely a construct of the number of vendors in the ecosystem that do different functions. And
well, let me give you one example where AI could potentially solve it. We've got all this tooling that measures end user experience. Let's say you've got a VDI or SBC user that is underperforming, and it may be because of a VM sizing issue. And the AI identifies poor performance, and automatically reclassifies the user into a different sized environment at the next logon, or even dynamically right sizes the VM live, adding CPUs or adding RAM or whatever the case may be. So thoughts on how that might become more autonomous?
That sounds like a turbonomic use case to me. So it's almost like there's a company in the market that does that thing that you just mentioned. But I guess my point is, I see that AI is going to transform each of these individual vendors, and the ones that are adopting AI technologies into their product and into their development process are going to see the most benefit right away. They're going to expose some of those AI capabilities to the admins and to the people that are actually functioning and managing the environment. But if nothing else, if app teams take advantage of AI to accelerate the development process, that's going to be a huge boom for our industry. If they expose that AI capability to the admins or to the operators that are actually going to be implementing and using the solution to that point of improving user experience, that's even better. right? But I think AI is shaping every aspect of what we're dealing with. And at a minimum, these software development companies, and I hate to bag on a company that's already been beaten while they're down, so that they don't end up in the news like SolarWinds, companies need to be leveraging private AI if they're going to leverage AI at all, because the vulnerabilities of putting their crown jewels, their intellectual property, their code samples, whatever that may be, out into a public environment, it's too high, it's too risky. And so leveraging private AI is the way to go. Leveraging that within the product and exposing it to the admins is another aspect of that. But do I think that the landscape of vendor simplification is really going to change in the next 5 to 10 years? I don't, because all of our attempts that we've seen of consolidation of these vendors into, well, there's one company that does all these different aspects of things. That may be the case. It might be one company that does all these aspects, but they're all separate silos of business units and different teams that write code separately that don't have integration as well as they want across the board. And so from my perspective, when I'm not going to bag on any particular vendor too much, because we ultimately love and support these technologies. We wouldn't be here if those technologies were not there. But years back, 5, 10 plus years back, when companies were going through acquisition mode, company after company after company got bought and brought into the ecosystem. You might say, oh, that's simplification because now it's under one umbrella, one organization. But to the admin, it's not simpler to have all these disparate products that don't integrate or talk to each other the way that they should, especially if they're owned by the same company. That's like the worst experience in the world, because when you call up support and you ask, hey, why isn't this product working with this product through this interface? And they say, well, that's a different team. We haven't actually tested that through the QA process. That's not a good user experience. It's not a good admin experience either. So Hexagrid, I think, is complex and is going to continue to be complex as a concept for the next 5 to 10 years. But the point that we made earlier in the webinar, and this is for people to have a takeaway, you're not going to use all of these technologies that are in the Hexagrid. You need to be understanding and aware of what the market looks like so that you can pick and choose which are the right ones that address those requirements for my business users so that I can actually deliver a complete solution.
All right, Dane, thank you. Got another really great question here that I think we touched on a little bit earlier, but I want to read this one out to you. Very thought-provoking discussion organizations should be having internally now. What keeps companies from taking the first step to their next generation architecture, and how can they overcome those hurdles?
Lack of vision.
Come on, Dane, you're a consultant. You should love that. You can go in and say, boy, I've got my work cut out for me here.
There's no project that is more exciting for me to dive into than when I'm supporting an organization that has a vision of where they're going, and I'm there to enable that vision and help them accomplish what they're going for. I don't want to be the person that's establishing vision and roadmap and direction for every customer that I come in contact with. I can help fine tune it. I can help shape that vision. I can give input into that vision. But my experience has been just like the early days of VDI adoption, without a marketing plan, without a communication plan, how we're going to roll this out and be effective with our users. If the IT team that has taken on this obligation and responsibility doesn't fully own it, and I know that's a generic term that I'm probably, much like a lot of people in the industry, overusing that term. If the team doesn't own it, they're never going to be successful. And it starts with vision. And vision for where are we going as a team? Where are we going as a department? Where are we going to address these business demands that are coming at us from our customers? That vision is what's going to give them the roadmap that then these technology components slide into to give them a game plan for success. So I love having vision conversations. I love supporting organizations that are already on their journey, and I get to provide capabilities, resources, team members to help them get there.
Makes sense. Thank you, Dane. I think we're about at the end of our time here. I want to thank Dane for joining me. Really thought-provoking insights today. Great discussion. Thank you all for your questions and comments.
Just one quick plug, Shawn.
Sure.
And I know a lot of our webinar attendees are connected with both of us in social media. That's largely how they got the invite for this webinar. If anyone is coming in April, mid-April, I'll be in Scottsdale for EUC Unplugged. This is formerly EUC Masters Retreat. I'd love to have a dialogue there. Shawn, I'm sure the next in-person event that you go to, you'd love to have a dialogue there. There's nothing that's more heartwarming for me than to have somebody approach me and say, hey, I love this webinar. I wanted to talk more about this topic that you had discussed. So I'm very approachable. I'd love to have any interactions, whether social media or in person.
Great point, Dane. Absolutely. Always available to have a chat with anyone. If you want to ping me on social media, send me an email or meet me at an event, always open to having discussion. And a lot of times, I have a point of view that's, changes over time, or I was wrong before and I stand corrected later. So always love engaging conversations with others that have differing points of view. It helps me grow as an individual. For those that attended this webinar or those that maybe registered but couldn't attend the webinar, we will be sending out a recording link to everyone that has registered for the webinar, and that'll get posted out onto LinkedIn and Twitter. So certainly look for that in the coming days and weeks ahead. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you again, Dane. It was a really great discussion. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.